And here we go. The big primaries are over and the race to the November midterms is on. This time on Poll Hub, we're looking at the last pieces to fall into place, Arizona and Florida. And there were really no surprises in one of those states, but maybe the biggest surprise of the entire primary season in the other. We're going to talk about it. We'll also look at how well pollsters are prepared for November, including us. That'll be interesting. Let's get started. And hi, everybody. This is Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I am Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And for the first time ever on our 58th episode, we are not doing any part of this podcast from Poughkeepsie, New York. Actually, we did one in New York City.
That's right. Early on.
But this is our furthest remote.
Yes.
And where are we?
We're down here in lovely Cape May, New Jersey.
Southern New Jersey.
To get the pulse of the people, right?
Yes, and also just to get a little sun, which is very, very hot. Not cool elsewhere, and that phrase, cooler by the shore, is being tested right now.
Absolutely. So we have been out in the field all summer long in key states. We actually have more polls that we'll be seeing shortly from some of these other key states, but two big primaries this week, Arizona and Florida, two states that are arguably pretty purple now. I mean, Arizona hasn't quite in the presidential election become purple, but Florida certainly has gone back and forth, been decisive.
It was Trump by between 4 and 5 points in 2016. So.
Right. And it seemed Arizona. That's Arizona. And it does seem to be moving. And so it was interesting to be there and then into Florida. Let's talk about Arizona first because I think that's the one that got so much attention. This is an open Senate seat. Jeff Flake, U.S. Senator, Arizona, big Trump critic. He's Republican.
He's
stepping down, deciding not to run again. Might run for president in 2020, but that's another story. And so there was a scramble on the Republican side to fill that seat. There was Joe Arpaio, Sheriff Joe, who was convicted of a federal crime and then pardoned by the president, and he ran. And then Kelly Ward, who tied herself to be the most Trumpist of all the Trumpians. And then McSally, who is the winner here in the primary. And she is a bomber pilot?
Yep. First female, I believe.
Yeah.
I believe so.
And was the establishment candidate,
Yep.
and she won. Let's talk about that. What happened there?
Well, I think, first of all, Ward and was probably hurt by Sheriff Joe's entrance into the race because that took away some of the non-establishment, or at least divided it. The Democrats were certainly hoping for Ward or even Sheriff Joe to pull this one out because, running against McSally. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Running against McSally is, probably a taller order and a tougher. The state is turning purple. It's something that, Hillary Clinton had hoped in her dream of dreams that she might be competitive. But even our early polls showed in Arizona, a close distance between people who strongly approve of Donald Trump and strongly disapprove. I mean, that's a very wide everywhere, only single-digit difference in Arizona. And I think that this is also a state that we saw where a plurality of folks think that as the economy is improving, and he deserves credit for that. So as you look ahead to the general election, we see that Arizona is not an easy slam dunk for the Democrats by any stretch of the imagination, but one they may need to win if they're going to capture the majority in the Senate.
So we were in the field in June in Arizona. That's a long time away. So who knows what would end up happening as we had it. We saw McSally ahead by a little bit. What happened? What happened in Arizona from what you can tell, Barbara? Is this just a matter of the chips aligning, or is this on the one side with one of the candidates, or if you also the other way might be to look at it, if the other two are both very conservative, if they hadn't split the vote, you might have had a very conservative, not that McSally's not conservative, but a very conservative candidate.
It's interesting because, as Lee was mentioning, Trump's approval rating is 39%, at least at the time we were polling earlier on in the summer, and 47% disapprove. Now, that's not the worst margin that he has, but it's much more like what we're seeing nationally.
And in states that are notionally more Democratic.
Exactly. So absolutely, I think that I think you had a split vote, more of a split Trump vote between Ward and Sheriff Joe. I think that they were probably appealing to a similar voter in Arizona, and McSally looks like she had a wide margin, but from certainly two competitors.
And she's also concerned that she had to move a little bit more to the right during the primary than she probably would have wanted to now that she has the general election. But you
look at it, if you look at the race as a binary race, I mean, she really won narrowly.
Yeah.
And so
so what does that mean for those the people who supported Kelly Ward and Joe Arpaio? Are they a group, and we've seen these in other states, that are perhaps less enthused now to go to the polls because they don't love their candidate? Does that generally hold true in the past, or is it hard to predict?
It depends. I mean, these are case by case, I think, and I think you'd agree.
And
Barb.
also, I think that this election is not necessarily going to be about individual candidates in these states. I think it's very much going to be nationalized and being a referendum on the president.
Up or down on Trump.
Exactly. And so when we do look at, a number of states that tend to be purple, to lean Republican or be Republican, we are seeing a very similar intensity among the partisans on both the Democrat and Republican side.
So we did matchups, and this is back in June, but we matched up the Democrat who is expected to win. She did, Kyrsten Sinema, against Sheriff Joe and Kelly Ward and Martha McSally. And we have Sinema up over McSally in June. I mean, this is a long time ago, 49-38.
And understand, we also, I mean, at that point, she was not the nominee.
Right.
And so, you were asking this question in the context of a heated primary.
Yeah.
So, your question earlier about, well, where does the, Ward, and Arpaio vote go? It doesn't necessarily translate in an early matchup when you have that kind of a primary.
Sometimes the supporters of the losing candidate do then come home, and they might not be eager during the primary to say, oh, I do like McSally.
Right. The reason I raise this is that in so many comments that we see in Twitter, not so much questions, but comments about our poll and other polls is, you had X and so-and-so up by 10 points in your poll, and then that candidate lost. And it's like, well, that poll was 7 months earlier, or in this case, 2 months earlier. And I think it's really important to talk about here how, in asking the question in June about a hypothetical matchup, this kind of doesn't mean anything right now. It's kind of what I'm getting at. I don't want to overstate it,
but I think there is a narrative here.
Okay, so what is that narrative?
One of the things that I see is that
it's not the toss-up.
It's not the toss-up, and it's not the margin. And I think when we look at polls, we all focus on the margin: who's up, who's down, and how many points is somebody ahead or not. And so that can get confusing, and it can also be misleading. When I look at these toss-ups, what I'm seeing, we had Sinema and McSally. We had Sinema up by plus 11, so 49-38 back in June before they had their respective party nominations. And so what I'm seeing here is a pretty competitive race. Now, 11 looks like a lot of points, but in a state that has been plus 4 just 2 years ago, Republican, I think that's very competitive. There's neither candidate, I should say, has 50% or more. The only time that Sinema had plus 50 was against Sheriff Joe. Yeah. And certainly he would be the more polarizing, of the three
I saw
candidates.
One thing in that poll also that I thought was very, very interesting. In keeping with what Barb's saying, but a different statistic. We asked people in that poll in June whether they consider the midterm elections to be important or not. Now we're hearing about the Democratic enthusiasm advantage in a lot of states. In Arizona at that point, 74% of Democrats thought the midterms were very important. 74% of Republicans did. So it's one of the few places where the enthusiasm gap
doesn't exist. Yeah,
The
that's
the
not
gap
there.
is no gap.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that's important. And I think also while we're talking about Arizona, of course, the sad news about Arizona during the week was the passing of John McCain.
There's another Senate. The other senator from Arizona is John McCain, who passed away.
And then, there was a little bit of byplay after that with the president and all those kinds of things.
But I find him I find him an interesting and a very kind of transitional figure in our politics, because I remember seeing him in New Hampshire. I think it was in 2000, and here he was, a very traditional politician, war hero, and I went to one of his rallies. And he was such a showman. And I guess I was a little surprised by that. I knew him mostly from the news and seeing him as a statesman. But he was really that transition between a very serious, thoughtful politician that certainly had the very traditional resume, but was,
very an unusual resume given his war record.
But traditional in the sense at that point in time,
absolutely.
that he was a war hero, and that was something that was very respected, and people really assumed that was a path that you took if you wanted to go into politics at that point. And so that's why I'm saying it was transitional, because then on the other hand, I'm seeing it was almost like a stand-up routine. It was very interesting. It was energizing. It was engaging, and kind of spoke to some of the kind of entertainment value that politics has become.
If we were in New Hampshire, we would have thought we were somewhere in the Borscht Belt. I mean, it was very
very fun.
Engaging. That was during the whole Straight Talk Express and all that. And one of the things in this era of such divided politics, he had great relations with the media. He was a great interviewer. He had was very open with them. I'm sure you experienced that at different times, Jay.
I covered him in his first term in Arizona.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in his first term.
What was he like
then?
then?
Dennis DeConcini and John McCain, and he was the junior senator. Dennis DeConcini was the senior senator. Actually, it's interesting because I covered him during one of the pivotal moments in his career, which could have ended his career, which was the Keating 5 hearings. And just very briefly, Charles Keating was a big real estate developer in Arizona, and he had bought a savings and loan in California, and 5 senators, including both Arizona senators, and John McCain was one, were accused of and eventually not convicted of, but found to have aided him in ways that were not entirely within the rules of the Senate. And this could have been one of those moments that ended a young senator's career. He was the only Republican, and it was kind of widely perceived, I think, in Washington, that there were 4 Democrats. He had to have a Republican in there, to make it bipartisan scandal.
Yes.
And covering it as a reporter and seeing it from the Arizona side, and also having covered Charles Keating. John McCain was the least involved of those 5, and was someone who seemed very uncomfortable. When you listened to there were tapes, there was transcripts, there was all kinds of stuff of him in these meetings. He seemed very uncomfortable doing the things or doing the favors that he was being asked, and did fairly few of them in comparison. And while Dennis DeConcini was very smooth, kind of traditional in that way politician, John McCain, in his dealings with the local press anyway, at that stage, was much rougher. And he was not necessarily an easy interview or a good interview, but he was a forthright interview. And that's something that
that's carried through. Absolutely.
So he was not afraid. He was not somebody who minced words about how he didn't do this, didn't do that. It's all a witch hunt. There was none of that. He never complained that he was the only Republican in there because there had to be a Republican. He kind of took his licks and moved on, and had a stellar, amazing Senate career.
And of course, his war record is well known. I think it's also in the final months of his life worth noting that in many ways he planned this week, the week after he died, in terms of a statement that was put out that he had written prior to this, in picking people who were to eulogize him, including, it's noted, the candidates who he'd run against.
The 2 who beat him.
Yeah, Bush.
Barack Obama in the general and George Bush in 2000, which was a Dirty race in South Carolina.
Yeah, and yet now and I think there's clearly a message that he was trying to posthumously point out about how politics can be a more civil undertaking certainly at this point. And I think also, and you talked about how he was handling the Keating 5 scandal in his conversation with his good friend Lindsey Graham, very close to McCain's passing. He said, among other things, "I don't feel cheated," and I thought that was sort of a very amazing statement that you make where he was in his life and given what his life had been. Yeah. So he didn't feel cheated, and that's probably something everybody should hope that they can say at that moment and the final moments of their lives.
But he will be missed.
Yes, and I think in this day and age especially so.
Let's switch to Florida, which is the other state that had a primary.
Surprise, surprise.
So, right, Arizona, Martha McSally was not actually really a surprise. There was no polls that showed anything different. There were no polls in this case that showed that Gillum would win. Andrew Gillum would win this race. He's a Democrat, mayor of Tallahassee. Was in most polls in third or fourth place and not close. Nope. Pretty far away, including a couple polls that were right near the end. We polled back in June and had him, in
single
digits, and he won. He won over an establishment favorite, the daughter of a former, I believe, governor and senator. He was senator. He was governor too, I believe so. Yeah. So what happened there?
Well, I think one of the things that we found very interesting when we were polling back in June was this was a very wide open primary on both the Democrat and Republican side. 47% of Democrats told us that they were undecided at that point, and a pretty close proportion of Republicans said the same. So this was something that I think took shape over the last couple of months. And one of the things I find that is very different about Florida than many of the other states that we've been looking at is their primary system is what we call closed, which means only people who are registered or enrolled in that political party can vote in that primary. So if you are an independent and not registered as a Democrat or Republican, you don't have an opportunity to determine the nominees of either of those parties. And I think the candidates that we have ended up with in this instance, Gillum and DeSantis.
Ron DeSantis, a Republican, who was more likely to win based on the late polls, and Donald Trump had endorsed him.
And if you look at Democrats and Republicans in Florida, because it's closed, you are looking at the tribe on each side.
The most far to the right and the most far to the left in simplest terms of the candidates that were running.
And this is really interesting because back when I was studying political science, there was a notion that the political parties.
Did you use stone and chisels?
I did that too. And then later.
No, he was up to an abacus.
And then later, chalk on a blackboard, even something that's
papyrus reeds.
Yes, that too. But so here's what we're doing, and we're looking at these states way back when, and it almost seemed like the parties that allowed independents to vote in their primaries were somehow weak because they were allowing these non-Democrats and non-Republicans to participate. But now what we're seeing is if independents were involved in those primaries and voting in those, as they are in some states, that it might actually serve as a moderating force within those primaries and make the parties even more representative of the general electorate than they are. So right now in Floridians are going to have a tough choice because they're going to have people on the left and people on the right, and they're both going to have to be seen by voters as more extreme. And then do they modulate? Do they stick to their base? Do they try to go for the middle?
Well, the real question is who do independents do? Do they prefer somebody who is to the left of the center of the Democratic Party, or do they prefer someone who is to the right of whatever the center of the Republican Party is now, who is the most Trump of the Trumpians, the Trumpiest of the Trumpians?
And of course,
and what do they prefer?
Names like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders.
It makes it a very, very divided and polarized election, and I think that's what we're about to see in Florida.
Which is perhaps a snapshot of what we see across the entire country, right?
And it took about 12 hours from the time the primary was over till
It was
there
the
was
ne-
some
it wasn't
dust
even that.
up,
It was
yes.
the next morning.
Till racist issues became part of this campaign.
Right, because Andrew Gillum is African American, and he's the first major party candidate to run for governor in Florida as an African American. If he were to win, he'd be the first African American statewide elected official.
And then there were phrases that were used.
There were. By DeSantis, Ron DeSantis. He said, "Don't monkey this up," and that was perceived to be a racial comment, and so that started it all off on the morning after the election. So here we go in Florida. One quick thing about Florida that I found interesting is that the Democratic turnout was at a record high, not just for midterm, but it was higher than it had been in presidential elections. But the Republican turnout.
Also
very, very high.
Absolutely.
Which speaks to two things. One is enthusiasm really on both sides, but also this is a closed primary. So if there's that many Democrats and that many Republicans going, then it really is all about how many independents come to the polls and how many end up voting for you. So I would be really surprised if we didn't see both candidates at least attempt to make a pretty hard jog to the center, because they know they can count on their bases. They just saw those numbers. They can add up, right? They know how to do the math of how many million or million and a half voters on each side that they're going to get. But the independents are the decider, right?
Absolutely.
They're the deciders.
Which way they turn will determine
So
this.
which one of these candidates, DeSantis or Gillum, can most effectively say, well, I'm not as left or I'm not as right as you may think?
And of course, Florida is special for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the shooting was there. There's a mobilization of young people, multiple shootings.
Yeah, there's Orlando, there's Parkland, there's Jacksonville just last week. Yeah.
And the governor who's running, the current governor who's running for the Senate,
right,
Rick Scott, current governor, is obviously involved in a lot of issues currently. And then Gillum, the Democrat who's now running for governor, I guess one thing we know about Florida is it's unlikely that Scott and Gillum will win.
Well, I don't know.
Why do we know that?
I think that's got to be really tough. I mean,
Rick Scott and Andrew. Why would neither of them win?
Both of them winning. Both of them winning.
Both winning at the same
time.
Both winning. I see.
Yes.
A Republican governor and a Democratic. Who knows?
I don't know. I might disagree with you on that one, Lee.
All right.
I could see. I think that.
Would it be the
Governor
first time
Scott,
you would disagree with me?
But I think also Governor Scott, positioned himself very well and did an incredible job during the tragedies that occurred in Florida, and I think that people respect him for that. And I think more and more that there are a group of voters who are going to be going to the polls in Florida who are likely to make the difference in these races.
Split the ticket.
That will split.
He's perceived in Florida. He's got very high approval rating across the board.
Yep.
Which is a little unique.
Oh, we're ganging up on you, Lee.
Yeah.
Right.
Well. The other piece is that he has always been a very out there, in your face governor. He's all over the news all the time. Bill Nelson, who's a 3-term incumbent senator, astronaut, right? Was he Bill Nelson? No. Am I confusing him with somebody else?
I'm not
he worked
sure.
in the space program. Anyway,
sure.
So Bill Nelson's been there forever. Nobody knows who he is. I mean, the numbers when you look at the polls about recognition of do you know who do you know? Do you like him? Do you not like him? Do you not know enough about him? That not know enough about him for a 3-term incumbent is pretty striking. So, yeah, I wouldn't say that Rick Scott is necessarily not going to win, and Andrew Gillum wouldn't. We'll see.
Gosh, I'm feeling really sorry about even raising this point, but you know what? I'm sticking to my guns.
He became the second sitting member of the United States Congress to fly in space when he served as a payload specialist on the Space Shuttle Columbia.
There you go.
So all of these states that we're talking about really are a prelude to the 2018 midterms. This is arguably the biggest midterms, the biggest attention that the midterms have gotten in as long as I can remember.
Yeah,
there may be one that, 2006 was nothing like this,
No.
and it's really more like a presidential year. We're going to be polling a lot. I believe every organization is. Are we ready? Is the polling industry ready? Are we, where do we stand for 2018?
Well, as we've talked on other programs, I mean, there's a lot of different methods that are being used, and we did see that even in I guess, was it Arizona or was it in Florida?
Florida, the Gravis poll.
The Gravis poll, which was, I guess, an Ivy KVR poll, and they
I believe they use both an online panel and then the robocalls to collect their data. I did not see their methods specifically on the Florida poll. Sometimes they have said that they have added live interviewers, but I think that that's more haphazard.
So I guess that one thing's looking forward in the fall is among, obviously, people are going to be talking more about likely voters. Each organization does that differently in terms of defining a likely voter.
And so far, none of our polls have been likely.
No, and we'll be moving
we've
to
had,
that
We've
shortly.
had that question in our Twitter feed, too. Is
Yes.
How come we haven't gone to likely? So why didn't we do it in the summer, and why are we doing it in the fall?
We've always sort of resisted that until the voters are sort of focused more on the race, because what we see is, and perhaps this year more than others, will be a very unusual chemistry composition to the electorate. And so if you're relying on old models, past voter lists, you could miss the dynamic that is going to shape what 2018 is all about, and we want to be picking that up in our approaches once the election. So we do switch over now to likelies. So people should be well advised to see the organizations, how they're doing the polls, how they're defining it. There's a whole bunch of things the polls will vary by, and also, this has gotten to be expensive, as we talked about, and there'll be varying methods and varying quality to the polls. So I think those are important things as well.
Yeah, but I think that the issue of likely voters is a really important one, because the whole idea behind polling is that you are trying to give people a sense and a narrative about what is happening in a campaign. And we want to zero in on those people who are most likely to participate. Now, when I say most likely, we've talked a little bit about in the past how we use a probability model, which means we include everybody. We give them a score of how likely we think that they are to vote based on their interest in the race, their self-described chance of voting, and then also if they have participated in similar elections. Now, we're not using registration rolls, which many pollsters are. In other words, polling has gotten extremely expensive, and everybody's looking for ways to just make it a little easier to bear. And one of those ways is, instead of polling randomly everyone, all adults in a state, is that they go to the registration rolls and they choose people and they sample people from those lists. The difficulty with those lists is that there isn't necessarily a way of contacting the person that's connected to their name. There is an address, but few of us have done address-based sampling in decades.
We're not going door to door this season?
So
Only on
communication such as cell phones, landline phones, email addresses, those are not part of those registration lists. And so that's what makes it very difficult, because those people who you are able to access that information for are not necessarily the same as those people who you can't.
Yeah, and in a couple sentences, one of the things, I guess, most people who are consumers of polls have slowly learned that a lot of people don't weight by party. We don't weight by party. We can't. We wouldn't know how to do it if we wanted to do it.
This came up during the summer when we did polling in Wisconsin and Michigan, two states that were surprises in 2016, partly because, Trump won and he wasn't expected to, except the expectation came from polls that had been done much earlier in the season, like 2 or 3 weeks before the election, which in this election was much earlier. And so in the polls that we did, we were accused of weighting too heavily for Democrats in both. That we basically included more Democrats on purpose to try and make the poll more Democratic. And at the time, that we've done a couple podcasts on this, we showed how we don't.
So we don't weight by party.
We don't weight by party.
So don't say that we do, please. And then also, Barb, could you just briefly explain again, because it keeps coming up, is we weight by income. We do not weight by education. We feel that became sort of fighting the last war, because everybody felt that the polls were off last time, which they really weren't, and therefore
The good polls weren't.
The good polls weren't. But explain why we don't.
There's a couple things. I think we are seeing some very real differences when we're looking at education. And it's really based on people's experiences and life paths. And I don't, I think it also gets confused and taunted, in social media as, some people, are smarter than other people. This is not about, how smart you are. This is about a life path that you chose in terms of the amount of education that you had or needed for the career that you are pursuing. And so in 2016, it was kind of a morning after
Yes.
Election Day analysis that found when many of the pollsters went back and looked at their data, they said, oh, well, if I had just waited to what the census tells me the education levels are in the state, college versus non-college, my polling would have been more accurate. And that may have been true, but you need to make that analysis going into an election rather than trying to find the variables that might have fixed the past one.
That's like going to Vegas and knowing after the fact what the numbers are that are going to come
exactly.
up, and then going, oh, if I only bet that way, I would have won. Well,
Exactly. You
yes,
go to
that's
you go to that roulette wheel and you see the list of numbers.
3 never comes up. It's my birthday. I'd be rich.
So in terms of science and experimentation, that's kind of a questionable process. So people have been weighting and suggesting that all pollsters weight by education. One of the things, though, that was left out is, first of all, they also generally do not weight by income. And I think one of the things that did make our poll different in 2016 and did not require us to then go back and have to figure out why we didn't do well, because the last polls we did do were right on the money.
They were spot on the national.
Is because we do weight by income, and there is a very strong correlation or relationship between education and income. And the reason why pollsters had not really weighted by either of those demographic characteristics is because people are not necessarily forthcoming about their income. So what we end up with is what's called a high refusal rate. And then, okay, if you're going to weight by that variable, you're going to weight by that characteristic, and you have all these people who haven't told you what their income is. Now, what do you do with those people? And it's called kind of imputing data, which means you have to kind of make your best guess as to what it would be. We ask actually a number of questions with regard to income. So not only are we getting a category, but if someone isn't comfortable with our initial categories, we ask them a smaller number of categories and then a smaller number of categories, and we actually do not end up with a very high refusal rate. So we have done that over time. We are tracking whether weighting by education will be a better way of doing it this time around. But we are hesitant to change the model because there really wasn't a problem with
we're
our
wary
model.
of people fighting the last war.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a problem. There's one other thing I wanted to bring up, and maybe we can talk about a little bit more next week or in a future podcast, is, one of the polls that very often is guilty by association is the Fox News poll. Why? Because people think that the Fox News poll is sort of like Sean Hannity's private news poll. And in reality, the Fox News poll, and we want to point this out to even our MSNBC viewer fans, is a good poll. If you hear about the Fox News poll, this is not one that's being shaped in any way by an ideological approach. For example, in their most recent poll, like other polls, they have Donald Trump's approval rating underwater. They actually found that the GOP tax law is less popular right now than Obamacare. The generic spread between Democrats and Republicans, which is probably close to 8, 9, 10 points in most polls. Fox poll has it at 11 advantage to the Democrats.
One of the widest of any polls. Yeah.
A plurality and a growing number in the Fox poll say that Mueller will find Donald Trump guilty of some crimes or some impeachable offenses. You wouldn't expect to hear that from them. So I think that we wanted to make the point for the poll consumers, do not associate the Fox News poll as being any way done editorially to conform to what some people may be concerned or happy about is the Fox News
But likewise,
approach.
we do polling for NBC News on the state level, not the national polls. And we see comments in our Twitter feed all the time. Oh, you're just doing this for MSNBC, or you're just doing it for, the liberal MSNBC or whatever that is. And that's just not the case. It's not the name that's on the front of it or the sponsor that determines the scientific validity of a poll.
It's actually the methodology. And the Fox News poll is using scientific methodology. They are speaking to people on landline and cell phones, randomly selecting survey respondents from adults as a whole, and so it's certainly one to watch.
And that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith, as always, our strong, insightful executive producer. I might also add...
You're sounding like Trump here with all the
Yes,
adjectives.
yes. He does a huge job for us. And I might add also that in our audience today was Soji and Ziggy Carvalho, two canines. They're both sound asleep. I hope that isn't indicative of what this podcast sounded like.
Well, we'd also like to thank the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University, who provides us with the ability to look back in time at survey questions and results over the decades.
And thanks to all the people of Cape May for hosting us this
Yes,
week. That was very nice. You can send your questions to pollhub@marist.edu. Also reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter and Marist Poll on Facebook. That is what we monitor at all times, so that is always the best place to send your questions, and we'll answer those that are, nicely written. And also don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe.
Yeah, easy for you to say.
There's a button on whatever device you're listening to this. Tap it, and the next episode that comes out, you will be warned or alerted or whatever you want to call it, and it'll download, and then you'll be able to listen to it. Lee, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, also sound asleep are Nancy Miringoff and Daniela and Arthur Charter, who are also in the living room, I think, snoring heartily at this as well. So
let's not use that as an indication of the interest in our podcast.
We
our
hope
live
not.
audience was not as thrilled as hopefully our home audience will be.
Okay, well, and that does it for this week. See you soon.